The first thing they noticed was that he looked as if he were sleeping. On a cold winter morning in July 1983, a family drove into a secluded stretch of bushland in the Adelaide Hills. They weren't looking for a missing boy. They were searching for moss-covered rocks to take home for their garden. As they wandered near an isolated dirt airstrip outside Kersbrook, one of them stopped. Something was lying beneath the trees. At first glance, it looked like someone resting in the scrub. Then they moved closer. Curled tightly into a fetal position was the body of a teenage boy. His clothes were remarkably clean. His hair appeared freshly washed. Around his neck was a black leather dog collar. The same collar witnesses remembered seeing 7 weeks earlier, when 15-year-old Richard Kelvin walked away from a suburban football field, promising his parents he would be home in time for dinner. He never was. By the time detectives reached the scene, they realized this wasn't simply a murder investigation. Whoever had left Richard there had taken extraordinary care to erase their tracks. His body had been cleaned. Potential forensic evidence had been deliberately destroyed. Yet in trying to hide one crime, the killer or killers had revealed another. The post-mortem would uncover evidence suggesting Richard had not died on the night he disappeared. He had survived. For weeks, somewhere, hidden from the world, drugged, abused. And when investigators began following the evidence, it led them toward one of the darkest criminal investigations in Australian history. A case that would eventually become linked to a series of murders many detectives still believe were committed by more than one person. More than 40 years later, despite a murder conviction, police continue to ask the same question. Who else was there? Before we continue, if you appreciate carefully researched true crime documentaries that focus on the victims and the pursuit of justice, consider subscribing. Every new subscriber helps keep stories like Richard Kelvin's alive and ensures they are never forgotten. Now let's begin. Viewer discretion. This documentary examines the abduction and murder of a child. It includes discussion of violence, sexual assault, and other disturbing events based on court records, forensic evidence, and historical reporting. Some viewers may find the material distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. Adelaide, South Australia, was often described as one of Australia's safest cities. In the early 1980s, families left their doors unlocked. Teenagers rode bicycles across quiet suburbs, caught buses alone, and thought little of walking the last few blocks home after spending the afternoon with friends. It was the kind of place where routine felt permanent. Richard Kelvin lived in North Adelaide with his parents. Friends remembered him as energetic, easygoing, and football mad. Weekends revolved around kicking a football in the park, laughing with mates, and making plans for the week ahead. Like many 15-year-olds, he was beginning to enjoy a little independence. His parents trusted him, and he gave them every reason to. Richard wasn't known for disappearing without telling anyone. If he said he'd be home for dinner, he was home for dinner. That ordinary reliability would become one of the first signs that something was terribly wrong. His father, Rob Kelvin, was already a familiar face to almost every household in South Australia. Each evening, thousands of viewers watched him present the news with calm confidence. Off camera, however, colleagues described him as a devoted father who rarely let his demanding career come before his family. To viewers, he delivered the day's headlines. To Richard, he was simply Dad. Sunday, June 5, 1983, began like countless other weekends. The winter air carried a chill, but that didn't stop Richard from meeting a friend for an afternoon of Australian rules football. For hours, the boys kicked the ball across a local park, talking about school, sport, and the small things that fill teenage conversations. Nothing about the afternoon hinted that it would become one of the most closely examined days in South Australian criminal history. As evening approached, the friends made their way toward a nearby bus stop. One climbed aboard his bus. Richard turned toward home. Before leaving earlier that day, he'd made a few simple promises. He told his parents he'd be back in time for dinner. He planned to phone his girlfriend later that evening. They were ordinary promises, the kind families barely remember making, until they become the last words they ever hear. Richard's walk home should have taken only a few minutes. He knew every corner, every shortcut, every laneway, His house was so close that dinner was already waiting. Inside the Kelvin home, nothing seemed unusual. A family meal was being prepared. There was no reason to worry. Not yet. But somewhere between saying goodbye to his friend and reaching his front door, something happened. Something so sudden that it left almost no trace. No clear eyewitness. No obvious struggle. Only fragments. A raised voice. A cry that would later haunt those who heard it. The sharp slam of vehicle doors. Then the roar of an engine fading into the evening. Within seconds, Richard Kelvin had vanished. At first, no one imagined they were witnessing the beginning of one of Australia's most infamous homicide investigations. To neighbors, it was simply another quiet Sunday. To Richard's parents, it was the first evening of a nightmare that would never truly end. The first hour passed slowly. Richard's mother glanced at the clock, expecting to hear the familiar sound of the front door opening. Dinner was ready. His plate remained untouched. At first, there was no panic. Teenagers sometimes lost track of time. Perhaps he had stopped to speak with another friend. Maybe he'd missed his bus and decided to walk a different route. But as the evening grew darker, those ordinary explanations became harder to believe. Richard wasn't the type to disappear without saying a word. His parents began making phone calls. Friends hadn't seen him. His girlfriend was still waiting beside the telephone for the call he'd promised to make. It never came. Within a short time, police were contacted. Officers began retracing the route Richard should have taken home, starting near O'Connell Street and working toward the narrow laneway that connected the final stretch of his journey. It was there that the first troubling pieces of the puzzle emerged. Residents recalled hearing voices, not laughter, not a casual conversation, something sharper. Someone later remembered what sounded like a cry for help. Another recalled hearing car doors slam almost immediately afterward. Then came the sound everyone remembered. An engine revving hard. A vehicle with an unusually loud exhaust accelerating away from the area. Individually, those memories seemed insignificant. Together, they painted the outline of something deeply unsettling. Detectives believed whatever had happened unfolded in less than a minute. That raised an immediate question. Could one person really overpower a healthy 15-year-old boy, force him into a vehicle, and disappear before anyone nearby had time to react? Many investigators doubted it. Although no witness saw the entire incident, several officers would later say the speed of the abduction suggested planning, and possibly more than one offender. By sunrise the following morning, the search had intensified. Uniformed officers walked parks, vacant lots, creek beds, and reserves. Volunteers joined them. Search teams checked abandoned buildings and drainage channels. Each location held the possibility that Richard might simply be injured, waiting to be found. But every search ended the same way. Nothing. As news spread across Adelaide, the case rapidly transformed from a local missing person investigation into a story followed across South Australia. Richard's surname was impossible to ignore. His father, Rob Kelvin, appeared on television every evening delivering the day's biggest headlines. Now the biggest story in the state had become painfully personal. Colleagues later described the unimaginable contrast. One moment, Rob was expected to remain composed before thousands of viewers. The next, he was pleading for information that might help bring his son home. For audiences watching from their living rooms, it was heartbreaking. For the Kelvin family, it was unbearable. Every passing hour created another unanswered question. Where was Richard? Was he injured? Was he frightened? Was he even still in Adelaide? If Richard's story has already touched you, take a moment to like this video. It may seem like a small action, but it helps more people discover cases that still deserve answers decades later. Police treated every reported sighting seriously. Calls flooded the investigation. Someone believed they'd seen Richard boarding another bus. Another caller was convinced they'd passed him walking beside a road several suburbs away. A shopkeeper thought a customer resembled the missing teenager. Each report offered a surge of hope. Each one demanded police resources. Each one ultimately led nowhere. As the days passed, detectives assembled a timeline of Richard's final confirmed movements. He had spent the afternoon playing football with a friend. The two boys had walked together before separating. Richard began the familiar journey home alone. Then, only a few hundred meters from safety, the trail stopped. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. Yet experienced investigators knew people do not simply disappear. Someone had seen something. Someone knew more than they were saying. The challenge was finding that person before valuable evidence disappeared forever. Search operations expanded beyond the city. Bushland was combed. Waterways were searched. Helicopters swept across open country while officers interviewed hundreds of people. Days became weeks. The investigation grew larger. The answers did not. For Richard's parents, time became strangely distorted. Every ringing telephone brought a moment of hope. Every knock at the front door carried the possibility of news. Family friends visited constantly, offering support, meals, and encouragement. But there were no real comforts, only waiting and uncertainty. Behind the scenes, detectives quietly began considering possibilities they hoped were wrong. Richard had left no indication that he intended to run away. There had been no demands for money, no credible ransom communication, no evidence suggesting a family dispute or voluntary disappearance. The more investigators examined his life, the more convinced they became that Richard had been taken against his will. Still, they had almost nothing to tell the public. No suspect, no identified vehicle, no confirmed destination, just fragments. Fragments that refused to fit together. As the investigation entered its third week, authorities announced and later increased a financial reward for information, hoping someone reluctant to speak might finally come forward. The publicity generated thousands more conversations throughout Adelaide. People studied newspaper photographs. Neighbors replayed ordinary moments in their minds. Drivers wondered whether they had unknowingly passed the missing teenager. Despite the enormous public response, the central mystery remained unchanged. Richard Kelvin had disappeared during one of the shortest walks of his life. Then, gradually, detectives noticed another troubling pattern. The witness accounts describing the disturbance all suggested speed. Everything happened almost instantly. If Richard resisted, and investigators believed he almost certainly would have, how had the offenders subdued him so quickly? The possibility of multiple participants became increasingly difficult to dismiss. That theory would remain with investigators for decades. But at the time, it was only that. The theory. Without Richard, there was no way to know what had happened after those final moments in the laneway. The answers, if they still existed, were somewhere beyond the reach of the search teams. Weeks passed. Winter settled over South Australia. Hope slowly gave way to dread. Then, on the morning of July 24, 1983, a family exploring the Adelaide Hills made a discovery that transformed a missing person investigation into one of the state's most disturbing homicide cases. Nothing prepared the detectives for what they were about to find. And nothing prepared the Kelvin family for what the autopsy would reveal. The call reached Major Crime shortly before midday. Within minutes, detectives, forensic officers, and crime scene photographers were making their way toward the isolated dirt airstrip outside Kersbrook. The drive itself was unsettling. The further they traveled into the Adelaide Hills, the quieter the roads became. Tall eucalyptus trees lined the narrow tracks. Apart from the occasional farm gate or passing vehicle, there was little sign of life. Whoever had chosen this location had selected it carefully. It was secluded, difficult to stumble upon, yet not impossible to find. When investigators stepped beyond the police tape, an uneasy silence settled over the scene. There, lying among the scrub, was the body of a teenage boy. There was no attempt to bury him, no shallow grave, no covering of branches or soil. Instead, he had been positioned with unusual care. His knees were drawn tightly toward his chest. His head rested forward. His arms were folded close to his body. To detectives, it looked less like someone had collapsed, and more like someone had arranged him after death. The victim was soon identified as 15-year-old Richard Kelvin. 7 weeks earlier, he had disappeared while walking home for dinner. Now, his family had the answer they had feared the most. But the discovery of Richard's body marked only the beginning of a much darker investigation. Even before the post-mortem examination, experienced detectives noticed details that immediately stood out. Richard was still wearing the same clothing described by witnesses on the evening he vanished. His white t-shirt, blue jeans, white sneakers. Around his neck remained the black leather dog collar friends remembered him wearing as a fashion accessory. But something else caught investigators' attention. His clothing appeared unexpectedly clean. There was remarkably little dirt. Very little vegetation clung to the fabric. His hair also appeared clean. It suggested that someone had taken deliberate steps before leaving him in the bushland. That observation would later become a significant part of the forensic investigation. The body was carefully documented where it lay before being transported for examination. Every fiber, every strand of hair, every mark, every item of clothing. Detectives knew they would likely have only one opportunity to recover whatever evidence remained. For Richard's parents, those hours were unimaginable. The search was over. Hope had been replaced by certainty. But even in the midst of overwhelming grief, they still had no answers. Where had Richard been? Who had taken him? Why had he been missing for so long? The post-mortem examination began the following day. Almost immediately, the pathologist reached a conclusion that transformed the entire investigation. Richard had almost certainly not died on the evening he disappeared. Instead, the medical findings indicated he had survived for a considerable period after his abduction. For detectives, that realization was devastating. For weeks, while volunteers searched parks and bushland, while newspaper headlines appealed for information, while his family waited beside the telephone, Richard had still been alive, somewhere, hidden from public view. The examination also revealed evidence that Richard had suffered repeated violence during his captivity. Investigators concluded that he had endured prolonged abuse before receiving the injuries that ultimately caused his death. The findings shocked even experienced homicide detectives. This was unlike anything many of them had previously encountered. Then came the toxicology report. Laboratory analysis detected the presence of multiple sedative and hypnotic drugs. Rather than indicating a single exposure, investigators believed the combination suggested repeated administration over time. The working theory quickly became that Richard had been deliberately kept in a chemically subdued state during much of his captivity. That conclusion raised an entirely new series of questions. Where had those drugs come from? Who had access to them? And how had a missing teenager remained hidden for weeks without someone noticing? The investigation suddenly shifted direction. It was no longer simply about identifying where Richard had gone. It became a race to identify whoever possessed both the opportunity and the means to keep him captive for such an extended period. Before detectives could answer those questions, they first had to determine whether any physical evidence had survived. Despite the apparent effort to clean Richard's body, forensic scientists began an exhaustive examination of his clothing. Using microscopes and specialized collection techniques, they searched for the smallest traces that offenders often overlooked. Tiny fibers, loose hairs, fragments invisible to the naked eye. Sometimes the smallest piece of evidence tells the biggest story. If you're finding this documentary informative, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps us continue producing carefully researched, respectful investigations into cases that still matter today, and it helps keep the memories of victims like Richard Kelvin alive. Days turned into weeks as laboratory specialists compared every recovered sample. Detectives waited. The investigation had reached a crossroads. Without forensic evidence, the case might never progress beyond unanswered questions. Then the laboratory called. The first results suggested Richard had spent time inside a domestic environment before his death. Microscopic fibers recovered from his clothing were unlike those expected from the bushland where he had been found. Additional trace evidence strengthened that possibility. For investigators, it was the first tangible indication that Richard had almost certainly been held indoors during at least part of his captivity. Attention now turned toward identifying every possible location where those fibers could have originated. At the same time, detectives revisited another crucial piece of evidence: the sedative drugs. Some of the substances detected in Richard's system were uncommon enough to leave a paper trail. Prescription records, medical histories, pharmacy dispensing information. Investigators began working backwards. Somewhere among those records, they hoped to find a name. They had no way of knowing that their search was about to lead them to a man who had already appeared on the fringes of several disturbing investigations. His name was Bevan Spencer Von Einem, and before long, detectives would be knocking on his front door. For detectives, the name wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Bevan Spencer Von Einem had crossed their radar before, not as a convicted murderer, but as a man whose name seemed to surface around investigations involving young men under troubling circumstances. Now, another thread pointed in his direction. Investigators learned that one of the sedatives detected during Richard Kelvin's toxicology examination had been legally prescribed to Von Einem. By itself, that proved nothing. Thousands of prescriptions had been written across Australia. But in a case with almost no suspects, detectives couldn't afford to ignore even the smallest lead. Within days, they brought him in for questioning. He appeared calm, measured, soft-spoken. He denied any involvement in Richard's disappearance. According to his first account, he had spent the evening of June 5th at home, unwell with influenza. He insisted he had never seen Richard. He had no idea what had happened to him. While detectives questioned him, another team executed a search warrant at his home. Every room was photographed, every carpet vacuumed for trace evidence, every piece of upholstered furniture carefully examined. The search became painstakingly methodical. Nothing was considered too small to collect. Inside the residence, investigators located medication, including sedatives similar to those later identified in Richard's system. Again, this was not proof of murder, but it added another piece to an increasingly complex puzzle. The real breakthrough came weeks later. Inside the forensic laboratory, scientists began comparing microscopic fibers recovered from Richard's clothing with those collected from Von Einem's home. One by one, similarities emerged. Fibers consistent with carpets. Fibers consistent with household furnishings. The significance wasn't that any single fiber was unique. It was the sheer combination. Taken together, investigators believed they painted a picture that was difficult to dismiss. Hair evidence added another layer. Several hairs recovered from Richard's clothing were found to be microscopically consistent with samples voluntarily provided by Von Einem. Modern DNA technology capable of identifying a person from hair without roots did not exist at the time. Scientists could not state with absolute certainty that the hairs belonged to him, but they also could not exclude him. The evidence was circumstantial, yet each new finding appeared to strengthen the last. Then came another unexpected development. Faced with growing forensic evidence, Von Einem changed his story. The man who had originally claimed never to have seen Richard now admitted that he had, in fact, spent time with him on the evening of the disappearance. According to this new account, Richard had willingly entered his car. He claimed they talked for a while at his house. Then, he said, he drove the teenager back into Adelaide and dropped him off safely. Detectives immediately recognized the problem. The explanation directly contradicted his original statement. Two versions. Only one could be true. Investigators began asking a simple question. If he had lied about ever meeting Richard, what else had he lied about? The case slowly moved toward trial. There was no confession, no eyewitness to the murder, no murder weapon, no video recording. Instead, prosecutors prepared to present what they believed was an overwhelming collection of circumstantial evidence. Each piece alone might be challenged. Together, they argued, those pieces formed one unmistakable picture. Richard had been in Von Einem's environment. He had been exposed to drugs linked to the suspect. And the suspect had changed his story once confronted with the forensic findings. Still, one enormous mystery remained. Detectives continued returning to the same unanswered question. Could one man really have carried out every stage of this crime? The abduction, the weeks of captivity, the repeated administration of sedatives, the disposal of the body. Many investigators believed the answer was no. Long before the trial began, Some members of the investigation team had become convinced that other people were involved. The evidence, they believed, pointed toward a coordinated effort rather than a single offender acting alone. But proving that in court would be another matter entirely. The trial began under intense public attention. Courtrooms filled each day. Journalists packed the public gallery. Outside, television cameras waited for every arrival and departure. For Richard's parents, every session meant reliving the worst weeks of their lives. Medical experts described the injuries. Forensic scientists explained fiber transfers and microscopic hair analysis. Detectives outlined the investigation that had consumed more than a year of their lives. The prosecution argued that the evidence formed a continuous chain. Not perfect, but compelling. The defense challenged every link. They argued that fibers could transfer innocently, that microscopic hair comparison was not definitive. That suspicion, even strong suspicion, could never replace proof beyond reasonable doubt. It was now up to 12 jurors to decide. Before we hear the verdict, I'd like to ask one small favor. If you appreciate documentaries that prioritize facts over sensationalism and treat victims with dignity, please subscribe. Every subscription tells YouTube that carefully researched true crime deserves to be seen. It helps preserve the stories of victims like Richard Kelvin and ensures that cases with unanswered questions continue reaching people who may one day hold the missing piece. The jury listened for weeks. They examined photographs, reviewed forensic reports, heard testimony from scientists, investigators, and witnesses. Then they retired to deliberate. The courtroom fell silent. For Richard's family, those hours must have felt endless. Everything now rested on one decision. Would the evidence be enough? When the jury finally returned, every person in the courtroom stood. The foreman handed the verdict to the court officer. A moment later, the words echoed through the courtroom. Guilty. There was an audible release of emotion. Some wept. Others simply lowered their heads. Justice had been delivered, at least in part, because while one man had now been convicted of Richard Kelvin's murder, many detectives believed the investigation was far from over. For most homicide investigations, a conviction marks the end of the story. For Richard Kelvin's case, it marked the beginning of an even larger mystery. Although Bevan Spencer Von Einem had been found guilty of Richard's murder, many detectives walked away from the trial convinced they had only uncovered part of the truth. Too many questions remained unanswered. How had an athletic 15-year-old been abducted from a suburban street within seconds? Who had driven the vehicle witnesses heard speeding away? Who had supplied and administered the sedative drugs over the weeks of Richard's captivity? Who had washed his body, redressed him, and transported him into the Adelaide Hills? Investigators kept returning to the same conclusion. The evidence suggested Richard's ordeal had been too complex for one person acting alone. Over the years, detectives revisited several unsolved murders of young males committed in South Australia during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Each investigation had originally been handled as a separate tragedy. But viewed together, troubling similarities began to emerge. The victims were young. Several had disappeared without any obvious sign of a prolonged struggle. Some showed evidence consistent with prolonged abuse before death. Several were discovered in isolated locations after being transported from somewhere else. Detectives could not ignore the pattern. Those similarities eventually became associated with what the media would call the family murders. Despite the name, investigators never believed the victims were related. Instead, the title reflected allegations that a group of offenders, not a lone serial killer, had abducted, abused, and murdered young males over a period of years. It remains one of Australia's most controversial criminal investigations. Police interviewed hundreds of witnesses. Fresh statements continued to arrive years after Richard's murder. Some people claimed to have heard rumors. Others alleged knowledge of gatherings involving influential men. Several leads generated significant investigative effort. But criminal investigations are built on admissible evidence, not speculation. Many claims could not be independently verified. Others could not be proven to the legal standard required for prosecution. As a result, No additional person was convicted for Richard Kelvin's murder. That distinction is important. Investigators may develop theories. Courts require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are not always the same thing. Even so, senior investigators repeatedly stated that they believed Richard had not been held captive by one individual alone. That belief continued long after the trial ended. Years became decades. Scientific techniques improved. Cold case investigators revisited old exhibits. Witness statements were reviewed again. Evidence was re-examined through the lens of modern forensic science whenever possible. Every advance raised the same hope. Perhaps something overlooked in 1983 would finally identify another offender. For Richard's family, however, time could never undo what had happened. Birthdays arrived without celebration. Family milestones carried an empty place that could never truly be filled. The conviction of one man had brought a measure of justice. It had not brought every answer. And perhaps that is what makes this case continue to resonate more than 40 years later. It is not simply the brutality of the crime. It is the uncertainty that remains, the missing weeks, the unanswered questions, the possibility that someone else knew exactly what happened and never came forward. If you've stayed with us until this point, thank you. These stories are difficult to tell, but they matter. If you believe victims deserve to be remembered long after the headlines fade, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with someone who values careful, fact-based true crime documentaries. Every share helps keep these investigations alive and reminds the world that unanswered questions still deserve answers. In late 2025, detectives made one final attempt to obtain information from Von Einem while he was seriously ill in prison. After decades of public speculation, many hoped he might finally reveal what had happened during the weeks Richard was missing, or identify anyone else involved. Whether he provided investigators with meaningful new information has never been publicly disclosed. Shortly afterward, he died in custody. His death closed the final opportunity to question the only person ever convicted of Richard Kelvin's murder. For many investigators, it also marked the loss of a witness who may have carried crucial answers to the grave. Yet the investigation itself did not end. South Australia police have continued to maintain that the case remains open regarding any additional offenders who may have participated. Authorities have also continued to encourage anyone with credible information to come forward, because one unresolved detail can sometimes unlock an entire investigation. Imagine for a moment Richard's final ordinary day. A football with a friend, a familiar walk home, dinner waiting on the table, promises to be back soon. There was nothing extraordinary about it. That is precisely what makes this case so haunting. One ordinary Sunday evening became the dividing line between a family's life before and everything that followed. Richard Kelvin was 15 years old. He was a son, a friend, a teenager with plans for the next day, the next week, and the years ahead. Those plans were stolen. His family spent 7 agonizing weeks hoping he would come home. Instead, they were left with questions that still echo across generations. More than 4 decades later, one fact remains beyond dispute. Richard deserved to grow up. He deserved the future that was taken from him. And while one conviction brought a measure of accountability, investigators have long believed the complete story has never been told. Perhaps someone who remained silent then is still alive today. Perhaps a conversation once dismissed as insignificant now carries new meaning. Perhaps the final piece of this puzzle still exists, waiting for the right person to recognize its importance. Until that day comes, Richard Kelvin's case remains more than a chapter in Australia's criminal history. It is a reminder that justice is not measured only by convictions. Sometimes it is measured by a refusal to stop asking difficult questions, and by a determination to remember the victims whose voices can no longer be heard. Richard Kelvin's voice was silenced in 1983. His story should never be.